With you. Let us pray. Holy God, we give you thanks for this day, for this time that we have to be here in this holy place to worship you and to eat the food that's been prepared for us. Thank you for it. Bless it to our use and us to your service, and be with us now as we talk and as we listen and as we share with each other. And all of this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Amen. So you all are kind of stretching me this morning here with this. I grew up Southern Baptist, and we would call this back row Baptist. But yes, sir.
I do have a question. I noticed, I think, yesterday was the Episcopal Diocese Day at the ballpark or something like that.
It was Diocese of Missouri Day. Mm-hmm.
And we lost our 8th in a row. Does that mean that maybe we lost a little standing or something like that?
Didn't really think about it that way, but yeah, I don't know if you can blame the way that they're playing on God, you know? Yeah, or on us. So I think that most of you know that liturgically we are still celebrating Easter, and I think it's often easy to kind of move beyond Easter Day and the joy and celebration of that, and then to kind of be done with it, which is what we tend to do with other things like Christmas and other significant events. But in the church, we continue to celebrate the season of Easter for 50 days until the day of Pentecost. And so I wanted us to have what I hope will be a conversation, and not just you all listening to me talk, because I don't have a whole lot. I'm going to share a few things with you, but I wanted us just to have a little bit of a conversation about resurrection, about how that continues to influence us, and how it is that shapes and forms who we are, and really lies at the very crux of our faith. So I want to begin by reading to you one of the accounts of the resurrection. This is from Matthew's Gospel. As you know, the resurrection is depicted in all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The shortest version of it is Mark's version, and each of the Gospel writers was writing their story about Jesus and telling their account of the life of Jesus, really with one purpose in mind, and that was to get to the resurrection. You all may have heard me say this before, but if you look at what's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which tend to be more based on stories and different things that happened in Jesus' life from either the time of his birth or from the early days of his life until his death and resurrection. If you look closely at that, there's not a whole lot of detail about various things. In fact, if Matthew, Mark, or Luke were published now as an account of the life of Nathan Hayden, we might look at it and go, well, that's not going to sell. What about this? What did he do? Where did he go to school? Tell us more about his parents. Tell us more about the things that he did when he was a teenager. Tell us more about what he did. But we don't have that because that was really not the point of what they were trying to do or to convey. What they were trying to convey was the significance of what led to the death and then the resurrection of Jesus, which is what had transformed the lives of those that either they had known or that they had gained information from, that contributed to their ability to be able to write the accounts of the life of Jesus. So again, everything in the three what are referred to as the synoptic gospels, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that have different things that are common to all of them. And then to John, Matthew, Mark, everything points and leads us, the intentionality is to get to the resurrection. In fact, pretty early on, you begin to see how Jesus is making this move, toward Jerusalem. He's beginning to have conversations with his disciples about what's going to happen at the end. Our gospel lesson for today is taken from the 14th chapter of John, in which Jesus is, and it's the first part of what's known as his final discourse, and it goes on for quite a while. And Jesus starts by saying he's having a conversation with his disciples about the fact that he's not going to be with them forever. And that the end is coming. Now they don't really know they didn't really understand what that meant. But Jesus is trying to say to them that there's going to be a point where I'm not going to be with you, and you're not going to be able to see me any longer, or others are not going to be able to see me any longer, but you will continue to have an experience of me. You will continue to be able to see me and to experience me in different ways. And he begins by saying, don't let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. And then he goes on to talk about how, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, and if it were not so, I wouldn't have told you that I'm going to go and prepare a place for you, and I'm going to go and I'm going to prepare a place for you, and then I'm going to come back because I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with you always in some way. So again, that's the intent of what these gospel writers were trying to help those that they first wrote the accounts of Jesus' life for, and what they're trying to help us to see now is that really the point is to get to get to the resurrection. So you can make an argument that you can, if you say, well, I don't really know whether I believe in the birth, of how things happen with Jesus' birth. Okay, well, whatever. Maybe, but there are other things you can say, well, I'm not really. But everything hinges on the resurrection. Everything hinges on the resurrection. I mean, to be a person who says, I'm a follower of Jesus, I believe in Jesus, I'm a Christian, means believing that through his death and because of his resurrection, we're able to experience and know and to have some sense of an ongoing life, being in the ongoing presence of the one who gave us life in the beginning. So this is Matthew's account of the resurrection. A little different than what's in Mark. Little different than what's in little different than what's in Luke. But there, in Mark, but there's some similarities, and a little different from what's in Luke. But there's some similarities. Fairly different from what's in John because of something of the way that things transpire. But this is from Matthew. The day after the Sabbath day was the first day of the week. That day at dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other woman named Mary went to look at the tomb. And suddenly an angel of the Lord came from the sky, and there was a huge earthquake. The angel went to the tomb and rolled the stone away from the entrance, and then he sat on top of the stone. The angel was shining as bright as lightning. His clothes were as white as snow. The soldiers guarding the tomb were very afraid of the angel. They shook with fear and then became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know you're looking for Jesus, the one who was killed on the cross. But he's not here. He is risen from death as he said he would. Come and see the place where his body was. And go quickly and tell his followers, Jesus has risen from death. He's going into Galilee, and he will be there before you, and you will see him there." And then the angel said, "Now I have told you." So the women left the tomb quickly. They were afraid, but they were also very happy, and they ran to tell his followers what happened. Suddenly, Jesus was there in front of them, and he said, "Hello." The women went to him and, holding on to his feet, worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go tell my followers to go to Galilee, and you will see me there." So that, again, is one of the accounts that we have of the resurrection. That as it comes to us from Matthew's Gospel. So Jürgen Moltmann is a German theologian who's written a lot about crucifixion and resurrection, and he talks about how believing in the resurrection is not something that means just saying, okay, well, this is dogma, this is what the church tells me that I should believe. It's not about just noting a historical fact, but it means participating in this creative act of God's. Participating in this creative act of God's. So if you've been to church, if you were at the 8 o'clock service today, in my sermon, I reference part of a letter written by a priest in Birmingham, Alabama, who is the rector of a church that experienced a shooting last summer, in which 3 people were killed in their version of the Undercroft there. And he talks about how that church has chosen to, they as a people have chosen to, what he refers to as lean into the resurrection. Lean into the resurrection. And I think that is indicative of what Moltmann says about how we participate in this ongoing creative act of God. Resurrection, he says, is not just a consoling opium, not just something that makes us feel good, soothing us with the promise of a better world that is to come, or that is in the hereafter, but it is the energy for rebirth right now, for what happens every day. And it's not something that points us to another place, but it's focused on the here and now, on how it is how it is that God's always doing something new and bringing new life and bringing new life even in the face of tragedy and death. So I want us to have some conversation around this, because what I often sometimes find is that we stand up at times like today on Sundays and at other times, and we confess what we believe either through the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, and we talk about how we believe in the resurrection. We wear crosses. We have crosses in the church. Our liturgical year centers around getting to our celebration of the resurrection. But I sometimes wonder how much we really look at ourselves and as being those who are participating in the creative act of God. How is it that resurrection informs who we are and how we look at life, and how it is that we look at the possibility of ongoing life even in the face of tragedy and death, which we're experiencing quite a bit of right now. If you looked at the news yesterday, last evening, or today, you know that another mass shooting where I think nine people, including the shooter, were killed in a mall in the Dallas area. So we're continuing right now to be faced with the ongoing reality of the end of life, and I think it's just made more prominent by the fact that there's so much. It's so easy to get news. It's so many things are put up into our face. But then how is it that we, or can we, live into the reality that there's ongoing life, there's new creation, that it's not just something that I say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, the dogma of it, but how do we live into that? So I welcome your thoughts, your comments. Does any of this resonate with you? And remember, I have to bring this to you so that we can record it.
I guess what struck me in the quote up there was the bottom line, focused on the redemption of this one. Mm-hmm. And is that a common translation, or putting into action the resurrection? I had never heard that kind of idea of redemption and our responsibility for that.
So, Dudley, you saying, is it we've got another mic, don't we? Is it a common...
Is this Jurgen's look? Hang on. Is this Jurgen's take on things, or is this a common understanding of our role as we move forward? I've never heard of focus on the redemption of this world.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's
I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
it's fine with me.
It's certainly not unique to him. The idea that that hope or the concept of resurrection or even the idea of heaven is not necessarily something that's out there in another place, but that's part of what we are living into right now.
No, I love this. I think
Yeah.
it's great. I just, the first time I've ever heard you.
Yeah, and the hope is not something, because we there was somebody, excuse me, I'm trying to think. I was having a conversation with somebody recently about that, who said that they had, basically they'd grown up in a tradition that always was pointing to what was going to happen
After you die.
after you die. Yeah, that everything is about getting to heaven.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And that the focus of the spiritual life and that tradition, and I grew up in a similar tradition, as I mentioned a moment ago, as a Southern Baptist in the Deep South. Everything was about how you get to heaven, how you live, what you do, what you say, how you act. Everything is focused on. Nathan Hayden can identify with that some too in his background. Everything was about because and you still hear that, you'll hear that a lot in some of the more evangelical. In the more evangelical theology today, it's about how, woe is me, and how bad and sinful and horrible everything is here, and but it's going to get better. It's going to get better because you're all, when you get to heaven, everything will be okay. Well, what Moltmann is trying to say is that the hope and the resurrection is not focused on that, but it's focused on this.
Right. And for me, it also shifts responsibility. I think sometimes I feel like people, I guess I feel like people saying, well, when I get to heaven, and then God will take care of making life good for me. And I'll get redemption there. And this seems to me to put the responsibility back on me, a much more active participation thing, and make conscious choices about things.
Yeah.
Rather than just floating along and saying, oh, woe is me, there's nothing I can do.
Yep. Okay, great.
David, your homily this morning was provocative for me and somewhat confusing, and you're talking about Kubler-Ross and that love and fear are opposite emotions. I never thought about that. I'm an 80-year-old retired physician, and I've been, I guess, just because what's happening in the world around us, been pushed towards this fear, and then I realized, no, I am a resurrection person. I've always been a hopeful, positive guy. And there's a difference between fear and caution. And, I can be a resurrection person and still be cautious without being afraid.
Okay.
That's what I would want in a surgeon.
Kathy, did you have your hand up a moment ago?
Yes, I was excited because I'm not even familiar with Jürgen Moltmann, but I love what is said there. And the other day, we were watching a TV program about the universe, and how really there's no end, and how incomprehensible so many things are, just completely in awe. And this just is a lovely way of summarizing my theology in a way. I think the Bible is very important, but when we die, our brain is dead. It doesn't mean parts of us don't go on living. Even if we're burned, it's like there's carbon and there's things, if you look at the universe, it's just beyond our comprehension. And to me, that's where God comes in. It's just remarkable. Awing.
Okay, great. Thank you. My hardest job on Sunday mornings is keeping microphones together. Everything else I do is pretty easy compared to all this. So, other thoughts about Moltmann's.
So before everyone else spoke, I had something I wanted to say, but I'm still going to say it. I hope I don't look stupid. So I never had thought about the resurrection of Jesus was kind of supposed to make us think about our resurrection later on. So I guess that's what I'm just now learning. So, but I like the way he puts it to where we should be thinking about kind of resurrecting or reinventing ourselves, or like you're saying, leaning into the resurrection, which I like that quote much better than when I just found out that the resurrection was supposed to be about us being resurrected. Okay.
So that brings up a great point. So if you think about the language of baptism, you know, sometimes again we kind of go through the routines of that, participating in it because it's not our child or our grandchild. But part of the symbolism in baptism that connects of the water, and part of what is enfolded in the baptismal liturgy is that idea that we are buried with Christ. The prayer book says something, I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly. Maybe Nathan's got it, but in the prayer book there, we are buried with Christ in his death and in his resurrection. So part of the symbolism, you know, in our tradition, it's most often that we baptize as we do here with nice, beautiful fonts, and we have some water, but we don't have what some other traditions, or there are some Episcopal churches that do this, but where part of the intense symbolism of baptizing in a pool of water, or in some sort of baptistry, as they're called in some more Protestant churches, is that when a person goes all the way down into the water, there's that moment where what happens? You can't breathe. If you breathe, it's not good. So you literally go down into the water in death, and you come back up in new life. You know, and you see sometimes you've seen some of the YouTube videos of that happening, especially with younger children, where they come back up and they're breathing and gasping and that's again part of the symbolism, is we're buried with Christ in his death and in his coming into new life. So part of the symbolism of baptism is a new life in Christ. That's again part of this ongoing act of creation.
Is this the good mic or the bad mic?
It's a mic.
So the last sentence reminds me of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus taught us what's important and how we can be closer to God by being close to each other and helping each other. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's what resurrection is trying to be close with God, and that is on earth, trying to follow what Jesus wanted us to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. So how is it that in light of things that are very difficult to explain, unexplicable acts of violence that result in death or just death in general, how is it how does that connect? How does resurrection connect with you in that way?
One thing we all are born with is choice. And unfortunately, sometimes the culture, the surroundings of an individual make them so angry that they react. Jesus, I think, would be very forgiving because he understood where people had been before and how they got to where they are, and was the hope for redemption of their life. When these horrible things happen, I always say a prayer, not only for the shooter, but for the victims, but for the whole culture. Essentially, that's it.
Okay.
Some people like to say, you know, that's all part of God's plan. And I don't know how I feel about that. When someone my age dies and we have a celebration of his or her life, I can be happy about that they lived a good life and they've gone on to eternal life. But when somebody shoots a small child, I really have a hard time believing that that was part of God's plan. Is that part of this, of what we're talking about?
Well, I certainly think it can be. What I'm trying to get us to think about is how is it that resurrection informs how we look at how that informs the lens through which we look at at that type of thing. Now, whether that type of thing is part of God's plan is a different kind of conversation. But what I'm trying to help us to think through and hopefully talk about is, so in the face of something like that, where's resurrection? How does resurrection inform how we not only may look at that, but how does where is resurrection in that? See, because in a situation like that, you know, it becomes, you know, is resurrection just something that we fall back on? Is this, again, to use Moltmann's phrase, a consoling opium, soothing us with the promise of a better world? I mean, you know, you've probably heard or maybe even experienced a situation in which someone may have said, oh, well, you know, to use your example, when a child is killed, well, God must have needed another angel. Or that must have been, you know, part of God's plan. Well, you know, I have a hard time with that. That's a hard God for me to want to follow and worship. So I think where I am is, but we often fall back on it and say, oh, well, they've gone to a better place. But how does resurrection impact the reality of what just happened last night or whenever it was yesterday in Dallas? That you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's right. I think sometimes we don't always think about resurrection. Yeah.
That's the way it goes in our house. No. So many years ago, my sister lost a 22-month-old child to drowning. It was a horrible tragedy, and it happened with millions of people around who could all then feel guilty about it. And something like 85% of marriages where a child is lost do not survive. Theirs is very strong and still going all these years later, 40 years later. And not a while ago, my sister, who is very religious, started the Swim On Foundation, which is all about, it's called Swim Safer Waters in Memory of Nicholas, but it's about teaching swimming skills and drown proofing for, and it's focused on populations that wouldn't otherwise maybe have access to that. For me, that is the epitome of redeeming this one. So that's what that's about. It took a long time, but that hope was churning in her all that time, and then it emerged in this beautiful expression of redemption for me.
Well, and I was also going to say, Katie, bingo. Not only redemption, but that's resurrection, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because out of, one of the things that I mentioned in this letter part of the letter that I share, written by this priest in Birmingham, is that he talks about how even in the face of tragedy and death, there is the power of resurrection. And that's what that community has tried to lean into and to experience.
So I'm piggybacking on Katie, because that's sort of where I am too, is that you can, after an experience like the shootings or a death that was so horrifying, is that you can either be angry and kind of eat yourself alive, or a community eats itself or turns into stuff that's not helpful and being, well, if they did that to me, I'm going to hit back kind of thing. And so the whole idea of changing the way you think, like resurrection and a new awareness that there are things, this has brought me to thinking about things in a different way, and how am I going to respond in a new way that will make a difference and kind of avoid, change the way the world is, change the way healthcare is, because you research something, change the way your community is because you help them see that there is other ways to deal with people. You don't have to shoot them when you're angry. You could do something else, or how do you build that community back up so it's better? It's a whole idea of changing to a better a resurrection for me.
Redemption is response.
Okay, redemption is response, says Katie.
Okay.
But a positive one, not just, I gotta get a good one.
So, back to what you were saying, Charlie, about, God's plan. I mean, obviously the reality of life includes the reality of death, doesn't it? I mean, life and death are intricately connected in ways that none of us completely understand. And I think sometimes we tend to, separate those two. But I know that for me personally, as a priest, at every funeral, I try to convey that we're still, as we deal with the reality of death that's right in front of us. What we're always dealing with is what? My death, right? My death. Every time we go to every time somebody gets shot at a mall, what do you think about? Well, dang, that could be me.
There, but by the grace of God.
So we're always dealing with that mystery of life and death, and of how everything comes to an end. But then part of what I think the beauty of creation that God has put into place that's not the human part of creation that we can see and that we're seeing so dramatically right now is that there's always new life, isn't there? I mean, it wasn't very long ago that everything around here looked kind of like crap, didn't it? Brown, dead, nothing was real, cold, wind. Still have a little cold and wind, but you look around right now, what's going on? Everything is bursting with new life. And for that to have happened, we had to deal with the brown and what fell out of those trees in September and October, and then there's new birth, there's new life. So I mean, for me, for simple David, that helps, with thinking, okay, maybe that's what God's trying to say to us, is to point out that, look, that died, but then that lived, or that came back to life. That died so there could be new life.
I just want to say, Jesus suffered a lot. He went through grief, he went through sorrow, he went through anger. And when you mention how some people say, oh, that's God's will and all, it's the reason that's cruel to me is that it sort of doesn't account for the grief that the person is going through. And so maybe you have to go through the grief in order to get to the new life. I mean, and everybody's path on that is different. And so it's not like it's wonderful to rejoice in new life, but we do need to remember that he also suffered. And allow for that.
Absolutely, that's right. Without the suffering, without the cross, there is no resurrection, right?
Carrying that a little bit further, about 6 years ago, my husband got a death sentence. He got a disease, and they gave him 6 months to live. But it wasn't just him that got the sentence. Our family got the sentence, and our friends felt it. And we changed the way we dealt with each other, the way we saw life. Every day became a blessing. And we're now 6 years later. Medical care was great, but who knows what made this happen? But we see life in a different way, and much more positive than you'd think you're living with death. But in fact, we're living with the joys and the things that come with every day. and hope to pass that on.
Just hold on to it for a second, John. So we're about out of time, but I wanted to just share this with you. Brother Keith is a monk with the Society of St. John the Evangelist, which is an order of Episcopal monks in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And points out how in the appearances, and I didn't go into that in what I read from Matthew, but in the appearances, the post-resurrection appearances that Jesus made, it wasn't always immediately evident to those who experienced that it was Jesus. In John's Gospel, you may remember in John's Gospel, what happens right after Mary discovers the emptiness of the tomb is she's in a garden, and she thinks that Jesus is the gardener, and then realizes that it is actually the risen Jesus. And then in several of the accounts, the women are told by the angel or the angels that Jesus is risen and he's gone on ahead of you into that place where he told you that he was going, into Galilee. And he's going to meet you there. But then when he met them there, they didn't always recognize him. And then there's the wonderful story about the two who are walking along the road to a place called Emmaus, and they're talking, and they're sad, and their lives have been dramatically impacted because it's the day of the crucifixion, and or the day of the resurrection, and they're dealing with what's happened over the last several days with the crucifixion of Jesus, and they don't know Jesus until they don't recognize Jesus until they get to the point where they've actually, after they've invited him to stay, when they get to the place they're going, they've actually invited him to stay and have dinner with them, have a meal with him. And we're told that it was in the breaking of the bread that they recognized Jesus. Which is, again, connects to that last, what we refer to as being the Last Supper that he had with his disciples, in which he said, keep doing this, keep gathering together, keep breaking bread together, and every time you do this, think about me. When you eat this bread, when you drink this wine, think about me, which is what we do. Continue to do. And so each disciple, he says, is called to pay attention in a new way. His point being, you basically never know when Jesus is going to show up. See? I mean, part of the resurrection is experiencing the risen, continuing to experience the risen Jesus, because, these gospel writers, what Mark was like 40, 50 years after the resurrection, something like that. Yeah.
I think sooner than that, but still a while afterwards. Yeah.
But most of them were several decades after the resurrection. So some of their experience, what people were experiencing at that point was like what we experienced. They were hearing about what had happened, and they were continuing to have these experiences of the risen Jesus, which is all we've got, right? All we have, or how is it that we continue to be able to know and experience resurrection and experience Jesus in our lives in the same way that they did? Because it didn't just stop there. Because if it had stopped there, then we wouldn't be here now, right? If it had just stopped with a few appearances. And I mean, those people were obviously very dramatically impacted by the experience of the resurrected Jesus. And that's what propelled them to go and to tell the story. But it didn't, obviously, those appearances didn't just stop. Because if they did stop, again, we wouldn't be here. So as Brother Keith points out, the light shines forth only through a familiar word or personal gesture like the breaking of bread or the calling of a name. Each disciple is called to pay attention in a new way. So I just want to leave that with you as we think about, continue to live through and think about, how it is that we experience, how we know resurrection, is that it's an ongoing process. And I just really like, again, what this priest, John Burris, his reference to leaning into it, leaning into the resurrection. And letting that be what shapes and forms us even at those times when we experience loss and tragedy and death in our own lives, or when we see it as we unfortunately saw it again last night. All right. You did pretty good for Back Row Baptist this morning. Good to be with y'all. Thank you. God bless you.
Have a good day.